So welcome everybody to this, our first sort of place-based insight event for Scotland, covering central Scotland. We've got more coming up covering various areas. The next one is Glasgow on the 25th of October, and then we've got one for Edinburgh, and then one for South Scotland after that. So so we're kind of really quite excited actually to share all this detail and mapping, because it's sort of as I say, it's the first time that we've been able to really do this in a proper way for Scotland since everything that went on over the last couple of years. So yes, my name's Tessa Mcgregor, if you didn't know already. I basically head up the audience finder part of our organisation, the audience agency. So quite a few of you will know me already or have heard my name, but I'm about to introduce the kind of the gurus that will share all the insights for the morning. And obviously, housekeeping wise, as I say, we're being recorded, and please ask questions as we're going and put questions in the chat, and we'll try and answer them as we go along. And if we don't, obviously there's things that we can pick up later, we'll do so. And yeah, we're due to finish at midday, but there'll be a kind of Q&A session at the very end for about 15 minutes. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions after you've heard what's coming up, and seen all the very exciting mapping. So kind of with that, I will hand over to our Director of Evidence and Insight, otherwise known as Ollie the Guru. So Ollie, take it away, please.
Gosh, there's lots of digging up there.
I know, sorry.
What can I say? Anyway.
You deserve it.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Oliver, Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency. And for purposes of audio description, I am a white male, blonde hair, which is looking a little bit rain, whatever, from the school run this morning. But yes, so that's me. And I'm also joined by my colleagues Elise and Isaac, who will introduce themselves now.
Ollie, my name is Elise, and I'm a researcher on the evidence team as well. And for purpose of audio description, I'm a white woman with short black hair, standing in a room with some lovely shelves.
Hello, and I'm Isaac. So I'm the research assistant on the Evidence and Insight team, and I am a white man with blonde hair in my mid-20s.
Cool, thank you. I very carefully didn't remind everyone my age there. But anyway, so yes, so thank you for coming. Because we're relatively we're a small group, so do please feel free to contribute, chat. It can be kind of a bit more informal when we have a slightly smaller group, and we can really kind of try and answer your particular questions as we go on. So please do either pop in the chat, put your hand up, or just come on mic to ask things. Now, in terms of about Central Scotland, as ever, you are the local experts, but we're hopefully bringing some useful data to that. The one caveat I would say is that Elise has at least been to Central Scotland recently as part of cycling around the entire coast of the UK, which I'm continually impressed by. So yes, she has passed through, albeit probably at racing speed, who knows. So in terms of what we're going to talk about today, so we're talking about Central Scotland. So this region of Central Scotland, which slightly confusingly isn't the Central Belt, and indeed, depending how you look at it, may or may not even be the centre of Scotland. So here on the right, we've got a rather fun map by a guy called Alistair Ray, who was trying to work out during the middle of lockdown where actually is the centre of Scotland, and he did various different ways of saying, or if you try and fit it in a circle, where's the centre, or if you look at where the population is based, where's the centre, or if you look at literally just sort of like half north to south, half east to west, where's the centre. But at least according to one definition, Central Scotland is indeed this area we're looking at, which is the population weighted centroid. So practically all the people in the central belt kind of bring the average centre of Scotland far south enough. So it's a little place called Dollar, just outside Stirling. So there we are. So that's just a little bit of fun. The other maps we'll be showing will be slightly more to the point, but there we are. I rather like that one. So what we'll be talking about in the course of today's session is looking a bit about the local area and the local population. We'll be looking at who the audiences are, both in and also coming into that area. We'll bring in some other information from other sources, and then we'll have a bit of a sort of a chat about what that might all mean. Before we jump in with that, I was going to say a little bit of sort of background stuff about the information we're going to be using. So the first thing to say is this is the area we'll be looking at. Hopefully that's what you're expecting. And we're using a whole range of different sources of data. So some of this will be things like UK national and Scotland splits of sort of national data, such as our cultural participation monitor. So that's looking at what the whole population are thinking and feeling and doing and so forth in terms of cultural engagement. Then we can look at stuff that's on a more sub-regional basis using the audience spectrum segmentation model, using audience finder data, and progressively closer in using some of those sources, using census data. Target group index is the other one just on the list there. And then getting much more granular with lots of sort of mapping and details from the ward level and from area profile reports. We will share the slides later, both directly with you and online. So yes, don't worry about sort of scribbling down anything in particular. We're saying it will be there available. So if this is the area we're looking at, could I just have a quick in the chat? Could you just indicate whether you're familiar with audience spectrum as a segmentation model, because that might be quite helpful. I don't want to tell you at great length what it is if you're all really familiar with it. So can anyone say, is audience spectrum something that you have used maybe, or you haven't used? Or indeed just jump on the mic and say. Assuming you're all still there. So, okay, so maybe not everyone would be. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so in which case I will explain it. I just didn't want to bore you if it was old news. So, about audience spectrum. So audience spectrum, which we'll be using for chunks of, but not all of, this conversation, is a segmentation model. So it's a way of splitting up the whole of the UK population into groups based on the kinds of things they do culturally. So we took national survey data from the Taking Part survey and looked at that and said, what are the commonalities in how people engage with culture, either how much they do or what they do? How's that linked to geography and demography, so who they are? And so we can then map that onto really sort of local granular levels. Now, it's worth noting that because it was done off the Taking Part survey, it technically wasn't using Scottish respondents because obviously culture's devolved, but it is then modelled out to cover the whole of the UK. And I think sort of realistically, with a sample that big, I think we can say with a certain amount of confidence that people in Scotland aren't so very different. So we would expect this to kind of hold north of the border. And what we have is, broadly speaking, we've got some relatively higher engaged groups, we've got some relatively middle engaged groups, and we've got some relatively lower engaged groups. The higher engaged groups have three broad types to them. So there's metroculturals, who tend to be metropolitan, that's the name. very highly engaged in culture, sort of super keen. Big concentrations in London, but others in big urban centres, so particularly Edinburgh in Scotland. Experience seekers who tend, like metroculturals, to be graduates, but they tend to be a bit younger. They tend to live on sort of on the edges of large cities, and indeed where there are universities. We'll see plenty of them in a sec when we start looking at, for example, Dundee and St Andrews. And then commuter land culture buffs, who tends to be sort of very into their culture, but sort of further out, slightly older, slightly a little bit more traditional maybe in their tastes. We've then got our middle engaged groups, who are broadly speaking of these three types. So we've got dormitory dependables, which are a bit like a sort of dormitory town, kind of a often middle-aged or sort of later middle-aged, interested, will go to cultural things, aren't sort of defined by it. It's not their kind of core identity, but nonetheless sort of, are potentially prepared to, particularly sort of high-profile things. Home and heritage, who tend to be a bit more on the traditional side, more of a kind of what you might call, I guess, sort of National Trust member types. So a little bit older, more heritage tastes, that kind of thing. Often very rural, we'll see, particularly when we look across some of the areas to the north of this patch. And then trips and treats, which is sort of like a sort of young suburban families, that kind of profile. And then finally, we've got our lower engaged groups. And there's some sort of quite interesting things with these in Scotland in particular. Because we've got Kaleidoscope Creativity, which is a group which tends to be made up of often younger people, sort of younger people living in flats and things like that, but with some often more diverse, more sort of settled communities mixed in. But often in Scotland, those communities actually are often very sort of settled white communities in particular areas, rather than being more diverse. Up our street, which is sort of large swathes, particularly of sort of often former industrial cities and or sort of urban terraces. Frontline families, who tend to be sort of younger, lower income, particular family types, and supported communities. And supported communities are quite interesting because they're one of the groups that we split all of these groups recently to have two subtypes, but for that group in particular, there's very much a split between older people, often in sheltered accommodation, and some younger groups who are equally, quite low engaged in arts and culture typically, but obviously there's very much a generational difference there. So that's a very brief run through the segments. There's loads more information about them on our website. Well, I'll just give you a little bit of a flag of that kind of information in a sec. But broadly speaking, we did it off this national engagement survey and some other data about where people lived relative to cultural infrastructure. It was done by Experian. They dragged in all their other data. We used census data to kind of flesh it out. And now we've been able to compare it to survey and ticketing data. So we've got that kind of overview. We've got sort of summaries, segment by segment, so you can see how big they are as a group, and sort of total proportion, how culturally engaged they are, what they like, and a whole load of other things, including the subtypes mentioned, of which there are 20 that you just split into two. But I'll skip on from this quickly, but it'll be there available as a reference if you get the slides later on. So does anyone have any questions about that quick preamble in terms of some of the data sets we're looking at? Because if not, I will pass over to Elise to start talking a little bit about the local population. Okay.
Thanks, Zoe. Hello again, everyone. So we're going to talk first about not so much data we have about bookers, but just the baseline population, who lives in the area, what are the key demographic factors we know about them, hotspots for different demographic measures, indices of multiple deprivation in a second as well. And then obviously all the spectrum, which we just covered, we're going to look at the profile of the area, of essentially how many of those segments we find in central Scotland, and then on maps as well, seeing what it looks like in different geographies. Yeah, I'm quite excited to do an event on an area that I cycled through this summer, so that's quite fun, even though I just went along the coast, so I'm obviously missing quite a bit of Perth, Stirling and so on. Yeah, it still feels a little bit close to home, so to speak, which is nice.
Elise, you might have to go up the middle the next time.
Sorry, what?
I said you might have to go up the middle of the country the next time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that,
I need to go back.
So that we can cover all of the spots. Yeah.
And just to be clear, I didn't collect any of this data while on my bike. I just did it on the computer. Sorry. Yeah, so this is what we're going to cover, and we're going to start by just looking at where do people live? What's the population density? I don't think I can click on. There we go.
Just nod.
Yeah. So this is just to give us an overview of where people live in the region. So we're seeing obviously that people are very much concentrated on the coast or towards the coast in those cities and towns, and it gets obviously much more rural as we go towards the center of the country. And we've added these yellow squiggly lines. They're actually drive time areas, so it's showing you how far you can reach in a 30-minute drive time from Dundee and from Stirling, just to that we picked for the matter of giving an example, and also how many households are included in that area that's covered by the 30-minute drive time. So you can see Dundee is about 139,000 households, 30 minutes drive around Dundee, whereas Stirling you have 182,000 households. So that's sort of situate the population, and it'll be interesting to keep in mind when looking at other measures, the demographic factors later, because some areas may appear very big on the map, but if they're not containing a lot of people, then we can know that it's a little less impactful maybe. So then the next thing we're going to look at is Scotland compared to whole of Scotland. How does it fare? And we just picked out a few key measures to look at. And in broadly speaking, we can see that it's very much in line with Scotland as a whole. So a similar number of households that are families, similar number of students, despite having some of the bigger student towns in the country, and slightly more retirees, possibly because of a lot of those rural areas. And I think we're going to see with Fife as well a bit later. In terms of ethnic diversity, it is a bit whiter than Scottish average, which is already whiter than England. And in terms of that blue chart here is the highest level of qualification that's been obtained. So there's slightly fewer of the top level, which is people who've gone to university, essentially, higher education diploma. But broadly speaking, we're very much in line with the average, but it's kind of giving an idea of how big those groups that we're going to be talking about a bit more in detail are within the population. Now, I wanted to include about indices of multiple deprivation because I think they're a good way of getting an overview of how different areas compare. Because what we've seen is that Central Scotland is quite not divided in the sense of people are divided, but there's a lot of areas of extreme wealth and extreme poverty all sort of next to each other in this relatively small area. And especially in towns and cities. And so IMD, as they're called, or SIMD in Scotland, are a useful way to look at that. And this is taken from simd.scot website, which is really good. And it's this interactive map, and you can look at any wards in the country and see this this tab on the side. It will give you the detailed breakdown of how that place ranks against the national, against the rest of the country. So I highly recommend, if you haven't already looked at it before, have a look at it for your own area, if you're trying to get an idea for your local area. But this is how it works. Essentially, it's looking at, it's giving a rank to the area in terms of income, employment, access to health, access to education, access to housing, but also transport links, geographical access, and then a crime rates ranking. And it's grouping all of these together to give an overall rank. And then these are divided into 10, and the darkest red color is the most deprived 10% of the country. The darkest blue is the least deprived. So that's kind of how it works. And then on the next slide, I'm going to show you a bit more in detail on central Scotland, what it looks like. So we can see we've got both some of the darkest red and some of the darkest blue all in one, usually very close to each other, as we can see there in Dundee, or around the coast, around Kirkcaldy and so on. So that really gives us a clear view of how if, as an arts organization, you're really catering for very, very diverse groups all around, no matter where you're based, really. I think you can see, I know we have someone from Falkirk, you can see at the bottom there. Falkirk is a real little mosaic of all different sorts. And to give oh yeah, and then obviously going further north and west into the more rural parts, it gets a lot more uniformly blue, to sort of more affluent areas. Let's look in a bit more detail. Here we have a closer view of Dundee and Perth, and we're really seeing those blue rural areas, and down there in Fife it's very blue, very much in the least deprived deciles, and then Dundee and Perth have some real big pockets there of some of the more deprived areas, even going up to Arbroath. And then the next view will show you the southern part here. Yeah, it's a real mosaic. But just to see around Clackmannanshire and Fife and Falkirk, it gives you a better idea of where those pockets of higher deprivation are and where the pockets of least deprivation are. They're north of Stirling, for example. This is another thing to maybe keep in mind when we look at some future stuff. We'll come back to that a bit later. Now we're going to look at audience spectrum, which we talked about a bit earlier. So we have our 10 segments, which we covered, metroculturals and so on. And here you have the profile of Central Scotland, so the percentage of households that fall into each segments, compared to the profile of Scotland overall and compared to the UK, to give an idea of how it fares. So we're seeing that the four blue segments, the lowest engagement, they make up 47% of Central Scotland population, so almost half. And on top of that, you also have dormitory dependables. So those older groups in those more sort of dormitory towns further out in the outskirts of cities, they make up 16% on their own, which is slightly more than Scotland. But in general, we're seeing the profile of the area, again, to match Scotland, broadly speaking, except maybe for experience seekers. And that is probably because they would tend to be more in Edinburgh and Glasgow, in larger cities. And because we have a slightly older, more rural population than the national average in here. But you can see compared to the UK overall, there's a lot more of those lower engaged segments, especially kaleidoscope creativity, which we'll talk more about in a second. Now we're looking at these sub-segments, which we talked about a little bit. So we've divided our main segments into to see which kinds of those, like which kinds of dormitory dependables and which kinds of kaleidoscope creativity they are. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Ollie, but I believe we're seeing kaleidoscope creativity, the first segment, which are the older ones.
Yeah.
Yes, so again, that fits with what we were saying earlier, with a slightly older population. Whereas dormitory dependables, it's pretty evenly split, although a bit more of the number 2 segment, which are families, I believe, more family oriented. We'll double check that. But this is you can look back at that, and there's details on the subsegments on the website, and we'll post a link. So if you're interested.
On the dormitory dependables, the D2 group are the more kind of settled residents. So
thank you. Again, fits with what we were saying. So yeah, highly recommend having a look if you're interested. It's a really brilliant way to have a more detailed view of who is around you and who you could potentially reach. And we're going to be, this is all new stuff from this year, so we're going to be releasing more evidence around subsegments in the future, so keep an eye out if it's something that would be useful for you.
Also, just to say, sorry to chip in, but at our event about audience spectrum the other day, we had a particular case study about kaleidoscope creativity in Dundee. So if you're interested in audiences in Dundee, there's a little bit of detail there. And the tool does contain pen portraits, as well as sort of summary figures and things. And those are all on that website link. That's stuff.
Brilliant.
Okay.
That's for audience spectrum. And I wanted to just give you a bit more of an overview of the different areas within Central Scotland. So we've looked at local authorities, and broadly speaking, the most distinctive area is Dundee. It's the most diverse ethnically. It has a lot of families with young children, slightly younger population than the other local authorities. It's quite high for those lower engaged groups, kaleidoscope creativity and supported community and experience seekers, the younger groups, which makes sense because it's a student town as well. Falkirk has is slightly higher for families. Fife is slightly higher for middle-aged people and people in the sort of medium culture engagement groups. Angus, which is obviously more rural than the others, has predictably an older and more retired population. And cities like, well, towns like Stirling, Perth, Stirling, Dundee, Falkirk are higher for families, whereas more rural areas like Perth and Kinross and Angus are higher for older and retired populations. And in terms of actual, the split of the population between those places, Fife has the highest share, probably because it has a lot of medium towns rather than bigger towns. But then Dundee itself, because the local authority is just a city, it actually presents 15% of the total population. There we go. So that is sort of giving you an idea of how those areas compare. And now we talked all about families, retirees, all these sort of things. We wanted to see where were the top places they were on the map. So brought back my maps again. And I'm going to talk you through sort of where we can find the most of those groups. So families overall, the top wards for those places were in Dundee, Dunfermline, in the south of Dunfermline, and around Stirling as well, West Clackmannanshire. But then if we look at the difference of children's age groups in those families, it changes slightly. So the youngest children, age 0 to 4, they do stay very much in those places and around Falkirk and between Dundee and Perth. But then if we look at 5 to 11-year-olds, it moves a bit further south and more broadly towards the north of Dundee. And then the last age group, we're moving more towards, again, the south and also Forth and Endrick to the west. Slightly more rural, well, less urban areas, really, except maybe Northeast Dundee, but also this big area in the middle there between Perth and Fife. So it's just something to keep in mind where we talk about families, but not all families are sort of behave the same, and it can really depend depending on can really vary depending on the age of the children. So the next group that we were going to look at, again, retirees, like we said, they're more they really form this big crown around the top bit of the region, really in the rural areas and around Fife as well, and the more affluent rural areas, really, except maybe the one exception would be the very bottom of Fife between Kirkcaldy and Dunfermline. Yes, and then the next thing we looked at was, again, this level of education and people who have gone to university, who are, we're seeing them again in those more rural, affluent areas. St Andrews is second highest. North of Stirling is the highest ward. And we're seeing a lot of them, the top quartile is in this area around the Trossachs. So slightly different, really, from where the retirees are found, and where they're really like easily commutable, affluent areas, but slightly different again from professional occupations. So professional occupations are the sort of more jobs like doctor, lawyer, etc. And we're seeing some correlation with the previous one with the university education, but less in those in that Trossachs area, and a bit more in the Carts of Gowrie, the bit between Dundee and Perth there, and around the outskirts of Stirling. But again, Fife is still, yeah, the north bit of Fife, we're seeing a bit of a north-south divide with Fife, where the south coast has a bit more of those areas of multiple deprivation that are ranking high. And then this north bit, including St Andrews, is a bit more affluent. And I think finally we're looking at students. Unsurprisingly, we've got St Andrews, Dundee and Stirling. And those are really the strong pockets, and it's really sort of concentrated in the center of those cities, and then it kind of peters out. But there's still other areas where students might still live. So this was sort of just giving you a better idea of where those groups that might be of interest to you as potential audience members, where they live, or who might already be audience members, and sort of knowing where their sort of strongholds are. And
Elise, just to
yes,
clarify for people, so they're really sure about this. So when we talk about top quartile, second quartile, etc., what's that?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I skipped over that. So we're dividing all the wards in central Scotland into 4 groups, and the area that's coloured are just the top 2. So the top 25% of wards are the darkest colour, and then the second colour is the next quartile, the next 25%. So any area that's coloured are above the median for that one measure. And again, you can these slides will all be available after the talk, so you can have a look again and zoom in on an area that's interesting. Or now that I've explained how it works, you can go back and it'll probably make more sense. Yeah, and now we're going to go back to thinking in terms of audience spectrum. I showed you the profile, but we're going to see on a map what it actually looks like in terms of where those groups live. So this is just showing you the dominant segment by ward in the households. So it's looking at the profile of each ward and then just picking whichever segment is the top one in that ward. Then that's the color that is given with legend on the side there. So it's by no means saying that that there are none of the other segments in that place, but it's just saying this is where they are dominant. And we're seeing again those more rural, more established groups such as home and heritage and dormitory dependables in those outskirts, well, the north and the north bit of central Scotland. And then commuter land culture buffs, the more affluent commuters and higher engaged in terms of cultural engagement in that Trossachs area. And if we're thinking back to our indices of multiple deprivation, there were a lot in those in town centres and on that south coast of Fife. And we can see that's where there's a lot of pink and blue, and that's our kaleidoscope creativity, our experience seekers, up our streets, frontline families as well. So the lower cultural engagement, except for experience seekers, but maybe lower income, it kind of matches with those indices of multiple deprivation. And then in the middle, around the middle and around Fife, the trips and treats are also present. And again, we can also, thinking back to the previous map on students, those student towns all have these pockets of experience seekers, the often younger groups that have a more eclectic cultural taste. So this is just to give you an idea of where those groups might be, and maybe hopefully it'll make more sense now in terms of who those people are that we're talking about when we're talking about the segments. And I think we quickly have a zoomed view, yes, of those more urban places, and we can really see there the pockets of experience seekers. That blue pocket under Dundee is St Andrews, and yeah, you always have this combination of kaleidoscope creativity, frontline families, and experience seekers around towns. And then those more settled, slightly older affluent groups in the outskirts. And I think that the final thing I wanted to talk about with the population is maybe to give you, if you're familiar with certain wards in the area, then this might be useful to you to get an idea of where the places with the most of each segment. So metrocultural's the most engaged, quite affluent group, St Andrews, but still very small proportions, but it's probably unsurprising. Experience seekers, the ward with the highest is the West End, so that's in Dundee with 62%, and so on. So you can, yeah, feel free to have a look. Oh, I'm sorry, the last one seems to be cropped out, but yeah, feel free to have a look at that later. Yeah, if you want to pick out any that sound interesting, or that that you recognize, or that might be local to you, then that's a good way for you to know where you might find some of those segments. So this is just to give an overview of really Central Scotland in terms of who lives in your area. And the main takeaway, which I imagine won't be a surprise, is that there's a lot of variety depending on where you are in Central Scotland, and a lot of extreme highs and extreme lows on various measures. And no doubt that influences the makeup of your audience and how they behave. And I'll pass back over to Ollie to talk about that next topic.
Well, thanks, Elise. So just before we move on, does anyone have any comments or questions? Is there anything in there that surprised you, or things you'd like to say a little bit more about? So maybe if there's particular areas that you work in where you sort of saw what the audience picture was, and were wondering what the implications of that might be. Anyone got any reflections on that? Or did that all seem to make sense? So the thing I sometimes wonder is whether this kind of background demographic information, the extent to which it's kind of how obvious it is, or whether it's how new some of this information is. Hopefully seeing it visualized just gives you a really clear, sharp picture about where these particular groups are. Lovely. Okay. Well, I will push on and a little bit about what we can see about the local audience, sort of building on that, if you like, that kind of that basic structure of where the population is. Let's start having a look at who's engaging and where. We will probably take just a short break in a little bit, just so you get a chance to not have 2 solid hours of data. So we'll just take 5 minutes, but let's do a little bit of this bit first, just so that we've moved on a little. Okay, so the key thing to say about the local audience data we're looking at is that we are looking at the engagement behaviour by the people who live in central Scotland. That's our primary concern. So of course people tend to attend where they live. We'll talk more about that in a sec. And therefore, us having these venues involved is relevant, but this isn't just the audience to those venues, it's the audience in this area in general. So what people from central Scotland are doing. And the key thing that stands out to me when we start looking at the overall picture based on Audience Finder is that we saw, not huge, but real levels of growth in terms of audience size within central Scotland between 2016-17 and 2019-20. And in fact, if we then compare it to Scotland, it looks like essentially all of the audience growth that happened in Scotland happened here, or at least the net increase here was bigger than the increase across the whole of Scotland. So that's potentially quite an interesting thing. Now, when we think about kind of some of those other sort of larger centres, there does actually seem to be sort of more audience growth here, and we'll see in a bit about which groups it was were the ones who were growing. But yeah, this gives you just a sort of broad headline kind of figure. So of the data that we've got in Audience Finder, we're talking about 70,000-ish bookers across this area. So that, we think about the population being 500,000, we're talking about what would that be, about some 13-14% represented in the data. So it's quite good penetration of that background audience. Okay, so we've talked a bit about profiles in terms of the population profile before. So this is now looking at the profile of people who are attending performing arts, solid bars, or attending museums and heritage, which is the kind of, I don't know what to call it, so the slightly speckled, the checkerboard bars, and then the mesh kind of grey bars on the right are the comparisons to households. So what we can see from this is which segments are higher or lower in terms of engagement compared to the local population. And the thing that jumps out is that commuter land culture buffs particularly are kind of doubly overrepresented for either types of engagement compared to the background population. We know they're a highly engaged group, but I think it's quite notable just how prominent they are in terms of engagement. Indeed, they're the single largest segment when we look at the museums and heritage, which isn't always the case elsewhere. I think they're a little bit higher in the mix here than you might otherwise see. So that's community land culture buffs. So that's sort of worth being aware of. And remember, we saw on the mapping that they tend to be skewed out sort of towards the western side of central Scotland and up towards the Trossachs, but also including a little bit further south as well. The other highly engaged group that I think is particularly notable here, bearing in mind that metroculturals are a little bit of a rounding error, the numbers are so small, is experience seekers. Now, experience seekers tends to be quite highly culturally engaged. They tend to be quite interested, but they also, given that they're a bit younger, sort of earlier career, or indeed sometimes current students, have a tendency to have a much sort of higher price resistance. And you could have seen this when we started looking at the contrast between engaging in essentially paid ticketed events in the performing arts and museums and heritage, where often it's a free offer. And so they're respectively, they're below average and above average for each of those two. Now, it is worth noting, of course, that experience seekers might well be doing lots of other kind of performing arts, live ticketed events that we're not capturing an audience kind of. So, more kind of gig venue type things, or indeed, things like clubbing, etc., which we wouldn't be capturing. So it is partly about the mixture of organisations captured, which is obviously, linked to, if not, completely tied to the RFO portfolio, but worth being aware of. Looking further down the scale, as you would expect, underrepresented or lower engaged groups tend to be lower engaged. That sort of comes with the territory, but it's particularly true of these kaleidoscope creativities, and that isn't always true elsewhere. So that feels like a group that really is engaging particularly less here than perhaps they might be. And that's particularly on the museums heritage side, interestingly, which, given that you've got relatively more of the K1 subgroup, the kind of the slightly older settled community type, there could be opportunities for a link between the kind of local heritage and those sort of long-standing communities. So it feels like maybe there's more that could be developed in that area, which would bring those proportions up and bring the profile back into balance a little bit. But on the mid-engaged groups, particularly Dormitory Pendables, Home and Heritage, we're seeing really high levels of engagement there compared to the population. And indeed the Home and Heritage, I think that's particularly strong compared to what we often would see. So that's maybe sort of an interesting picture where, even though they tend to be slightly further out in the rural areas, they are travelling and going to attend things. Okay, then when we look at particular art forms, we do see, because this is obviously an overall picture in terms of these broad areas, that for individual art forms you do get a little bit more of a difference what's going on. Probably notably, experience seekers go to films quite a lot, so yeah, that kind of cinema one is relatively higher. Children and family shows, frontline families are much more likely to do those than other things, because they're obviously largely motivated by children in terms of engagement, children being obviously a big part of their lives. So that one is a little bit overrepresented for children and family shows compared to, despite being below for everything else. So that's maybe worth noting. And just flagging that Dormitory Dependables we see are heavily overrepresented when it comes to performing arts, even more overrepresented when we get to dance. So dance will be in particular engagement for that group. Community land culture buffs are pretty high for that as well. So again, depending on the particular art forms you're dealing with, particularly different types of people, particularly different areas will kind of come into play as being really key. Okay, so we talked about the overall sales trend from 2016-17 to 2019-20, the kind of pre-COVID years. And what we've shown here is how the profile changed through that period. So were different audiences being more or less engaged during that time? So these are based on the idea that whatever the percentage for that group was in 2016-17, we've kind of set that to 100. So if it's gone up compared to where it was, it ends up above 100. Down compared to where it was, it ends up below 100. It's not saying these are the biggest or smallest groups, it's just relative change from that kind of baseline. And the thing we see is a real kind of shooting up of experience seekers, a growth in trips and treats, frontline families, dormitory dependables. So what we're seeing is some middle engaged groups, and particularly with families, some of the slightly younger groups as well in the mix there. So those groups all appear to have been increasing in central Scotland, whereas some of the older groups have been reducing in terms of their engagement across that period. Now, we know if you fast forward into COVID and beyond COVID, that those older groups are also being particularly hard hit in terms of potential engagement. I think Isaac's going to say something about that in a bit. So again, that's likely to amplify this existing kind of direction of travel, which I guess means that if you're looking at planning events, in sort of targeting programming, in reaching a wider range of audiences, that the opportunities around some of those young groups, those middle engaged, those family groups, is growing already. So in a way, you'll be pushing it a bit more of an open door there than some other groups. So that might be something useful to factor into your thinking. Okay. Here we've got a bit of a rewind to the picture that Elise showed you of where the dominant segments are. So remember, this is the single largest segment in each of these different places. So to start with here, so just to remember to hold this in mind when we then look at the next picture, we've got this big band of community land culture buffs out to the west, little pocket there in the middle, but large swathes of home and heritage, big, these little bits of trips and treats. Although it's underrepresented as no group overall, they're really quite concentrated into those areas in the middle. And again, these lower engaged groups that Elise referenced being around some of the cities and city centres. So that's the background population. But if we look at the dominant profile of bookers, so who's actually booking from these areas as opposed to who just lives there, we see a slightly different picture. And essentially what happens is that community land culture buff sweeps outwards, the dormitory dependables spreads across the board. You remember seeing that kind of 24% engaging in performing arts. So they're really kind of large areas. The experience seeker blue pockets are holding their own in all these areas because they're relatively highly engaged, so you'd expect them to be overrepresented. But generally speaking, it's a much sort of flatter picture. So amidst this very varied population, the actual engagement layer is much more static. So here we can see the more zoomed in view. So this is the population view again. So if we just look at Dundee, we can see that experience seeker sort of line along the coast. Sort of the waterfront near the V&A. And then if we switch, you can see that that bit holds its own, but the dormitory dependables become more dominant than everything else. And then if we look down back to the bottom, we see a similar picture. Well, the big areas with closed group creativity, and some of these sort of older areas like the Coddy, many of them, the dormitory dependables become dominant. In fact, the Coddy is the exception, where it's more of the product of closed group creativity, even in the attendance. So again, that's giving a sense of sort of what's the audience landscape rather than just the population landscape. This is making it slightly easier to see, which is just zooming in to say these are only the ones that changed. So everything that stayed the same is grayed out. So in the population, these areas that changed were largely the big trips and treats areas we saw, the big pockets of home and heritage, some of those lower engaged bits, and those are all switching essentially to 2 or 3 of these other sort of larger, more engaged segments. Okay, so I think that's a good moment just to take a quick 5-minute stretch and recharge your coffee cups. Does anyone have any questions about what we've brilliant. Okay, so I didn't see any queries in the chat from the first bit, although there's a shrewd comment there from Tessa saying there's just a lot of stuff, which is true. So yes, it might take a bit of digesting, it might take sort of revisiting it, or perhaps you're delightedly overwhelmed. That's a nice thing.
Yeah.
But yes,
obviously I was trying to use the right phrase, and I think probably delightedly overwhelmed is probably close, but yes.
It's a good phrase, but yes. But equally, there are no silly questions. So if there's something you generally don't get, that's totally fine. One of the benefits of having a smaller group is that we can talk a bit more about very particular things if you're curious. So do take advantage of that if you would like. But in the meantime, let's surge onward with more data chat and look at the actual attendance pattern of local audiences. So, so the first thing here then is looking at which of the local authorities, oh, there's a typo that didn't get corrected, which of the local authorities are people attending in from the different places. And obviously this will partly be dependent on the particular organisations that are in the mix, but we can see, generally speaking, yeah, Dundee and Angus, because obviously Angus acting as sort of like a rural hinterland, which is Dundee. Dundee is the largest place that they're attending, and that's really very dominantly the case for Dundee itself. And similarly, kind of, you know, similar relationship really there with Stirling and Clackmannanshire. But Falkirk, because of its particular location, is actually people are largely attending outside of what we're classifying as central Scotland, because of course there's loads of, you know, opportunities to attend in Glasgow, loads of opportunities to attend in Edinburgh as well. Fife, similarly, large concentrations attending locally, but again, more of a stretch towards other areas. Perth and Kinross, a little bit like Dundee, very, you know, kind of very concentrated. And I guess that, yeah, that'll be Horse Cross Arts really, you know, sort of pulling in a local audience particularly. So, so that's the overall picture we're seeing. It is worth noting that other parts of Scotland are still a reasonable chunk of the overall audience. So, you know, a quarter of the overall audience of people in this area are attending elsewhere in Scotland, but very few, unsurprisingly, elsewhere in the UK. Okay. However, we then looked at this by time of year to see, you know, how's it varying, and in the summer, lots of people from this area are travelling elsewhere and then attending in those other places. But that is particularly, again, it's elsewhere in Scotland. It's not about you know, so the rest of the UK. And of course, you know, that's Edinburgh Festival season and so forth. So you'd kind of expect that to be part of the picture there as well. There is a bit of seasonal variation. We'll also look in a sec about other seasonal variation. But here's the art form difference by where people are attending. And here you can see that, for, you know, unsurprisingly, people attend film locally. So, you know, people from this area are almost all watching film in this area. There'll be a slight boundary effect probably, but essentially that's what's going on. But there's a much different picture when we start looking at other things like dance attendance, where you've got, you know, getting on for a third of the population, sorry, a third of bookings attending, taking place elsewhere in Scotland. So that's maybe worth noting. And again, some of the more particular art forms which you've kind of grouped into other ticketing, again, you get a kind of similar effect. In very particular things, they may be less available locally, but travelling further, to engage with it. But then things like Christmas shows, people tend to attend Christmas shows locally. So yes, there's the spatial arrangement of the audience is varying by art form as well as by time of year. Okay. So in the audience finder surveys, we've also asked people about whether they had attended before, and if they had, whether it had been in the last year. So this is all surveys anywhere in the country for people from central Scotland. But over half of those people were saying that they were a first-time visitor to wherever they've been. And then, you know, if they weren't a first-time visitor, then they were relatively more frequent visitor in the sense that they'd already been in the last year. So relatively few people were kind of going somewhere, but university you've been to longer ago. And this is aggregated from that whole kind of data set from going back multiple years, outside of the COVID times. So if we then look at how that varies by their profile, do different types of people behave differently in terms of being first-time visitors, etc. We do see that there's a higher proportion of community land culture buffs who've been before, but not that recently, whereas experience seekers are much more likely to have been before and within the last year. So again, it's that kind of for the surveys, this is often free attractions. We know that they're culturally engaged but have price barriers, and so we're seeing that they are engaging repeatedly where they can. And similarly to community land culture buffs, home and heritage, again, just tending to be on a slightly slower repeat cycle in terms of engagement. Would we thought experience would be higher first time? That's interesting. Is that on the basis that they are more likely to try new things? Is that what you're thinking, Gillian?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I thought they would be more likely to try new things, especially given the kind of staycation period that we've been in, and they would be more willing to travel and experience new things, but obviously not. Yes,
but what's interesting about experiencing is they don't travel as much as some of the other groups. So they often don't head out to other areas as much as others do. So it might be that they're engaging frequently with the things that are around them, but not necessarily journeying so much. And it's something we've seen crop up in a couple of different places where, despite them being highly engaged, and I guess lots of it's just economics really, but it's harder for them to go elsewhere. But yeah, no, it is interesting given they do have a desire for novelty. So yes, there is a slight paradox there. Okay, so we are seeing sort of slightly different behaviours there. So this, if I move the chat, so it's not covering the actual map. So this is showing specifically where people are coming from, and this is showing as a proportion of the households that are in that area, where the big concentrations. So I think this is quite interesting because we've got quite a big concentration, I guess, around sort of like sort of Perth and around the top of the Tay, which is probably partly influenced by Horse Arts data being in the mix, I would have thought. But also we saw some reasonably big concentrations of moderately engaged groups there, and lots of people with professional qualifications and higher qualifications of professional occupations, as well as some of these student groups you can see in the kind of west end of Dundee. But the big concentrations of community land culture buff that we saw in the Northern Trossachs aren't seeming to engage in as high a proportion relative to the population as you might have expected. So I would guess what's happening there, and this is a slight guess, is that those groups might be engaging at quite high levels, but all the other groups that are more rural are engaging at much lower levels. So on average, it drops a bit. So you're seeing that kind of little bit with the north of Stirling where there's high concentration, but it isn't sort of stretching further afield. I suspect as well you're seeing a little of the effect of this sort of main road heading north out of Perth and making it easier to engage along that corridor than further afield. Okay, so that's where people are engaging by concentration. And again, this little sort of affluent pocket around Dunfermline is quite notable. And then you've got this really kind of white patch in Kirkcaldy, which is maybe notable. And then here, this is just based on actual pure numbers. And obviously, because the population is concentrated in those areas that Elise showed us earlier, that picture gets much starker. And so just by sheer numbers, it's really concentrated. There's pockets in Dundee, again, that pocket North Stirling, and a bit in Dunfermline. So, okay. So now this is saying if we only look at local organisations, bearing in mind that most people are engaging in local organisations anyway, but if we just look at local organisations, again, it pulls that engagement really much more central. So at the outer edges, some of the engagement is happening elsewhere. People are travelling out to other centres. You know, they're heading further up the coast, etc. They're heading, more of them are heading down to Glasgow and Edinburgh. So you're getting this really big concentration around Perth, which probably explains, the big theatre music hall there. And then just by sheer numbers, again, it just flattens that out a bit. So there's less concentration around Perth because the population isn't as high. Dundee again sort of comes slightly out to the fore. Okay. Everyone happy with that? Is that all clear? Because then, and this is where I have to try and make sure it doesn't get super confusing. So we've been talking about local people attending anywhere, and then we've just looked at just the local people attending locally. But of course, the flip side is non-local people attending locally. So we're just going to look at that group now, just to get a bit of a sense. So the local bookers to non-local audiences. So the local bookers to non-local organisations. So who's going out from this region to attend elsewhere, compared to who is coming in from elsewhere. So the non-local bookers to local organisations. Hopefully I managed to not turn that into a complete tangle. Excellent. So essentially what we're seeing is the proportion of people going out, dormitory dependables who tend to be sort of further spread out into the dormitory towns are more likely to go elsewhere. Lots of people in that group have cars, drive, and etc. So you have slightly more movement. Although interestingly, the community land culture buffs do tend to stay a little bit more kind of, I guess, sort of loyal to the region, and that might partly be about where they're based and sort of coming sort of down south out of the Trossachs into Stirling, etc. Lower engaged groups are, I mean, you wouldn't expect them to travel as much for culture because it's less of a priority in terms of what they do, but it does seem that people are more likely to help elsewhere. So you've got the draw of the central belt venues in Glasgow and Edinburgh, which is maybe making it easier for people who are in those groups locally to go there as opposed to head in the other direction. So we're seeing a bit of a differentiation there. Again, experience seekers, they don't travel hugely, hence the sort of relatively lower proportions here. But they do appear, interestingly, to be more likely to travel into this area than travel out of it. I guess because where they are in the area, they're very concentrated in those very particular towns. So yeah, maybe that's what's going on. So they're not near the edges. And I don't know, maybe it's experience seekers from other smaller centres heading in, I would imagine, rather than it being coming largely from Edinburgh and Glasgow. But I don't know. That's a hypothesis. Not what's tested. Okay. So overall, what we're seeing is more people coming in than going out. Overall. This is the average figures for a year at the bottom, and then the total across the 4 years at the top, I believe. No.
I think it's still the average at the top.
It's the average at the top, sorry. So across a year, on average, there are 262,000 tickets bought by people from outside the area and 186,000 bought by people in the area elsewhere. There's substantial seasonality, so largely it lines up across much of the year, but there's much less of an inclination to go elsewhere in the autumn. So it doesn't look like what's happening. There's a big surge in the summer for people heading to Edinburgh. It seems just to be that in the autumn there's more attraction of people into the venues and into sort of the autumn season programs coming in from outside, and that's what's driving that difference in engagement. And it's sort of getting on for 50,000 of that gap is all just in that concentrating that one season. So yeah, you can see it there, but actually it's autumn and a little bit winter, but essentially that's where the difference is happening. Does anyone have any thoughts about why that might be happening, particularly based on your knowledge of the local area? Because it struck me as quite interesting and quite curious that it's going on, but it may be obvious to you. You think, oh yes, there's always this big series of events. So yeah, if anyone has any thoughts, again, do pop in the chat and do share your thoughts on that. Okay. So this is then showing, just to get a sense of where, if we're not just looking at the local area, where else are people coming from? And you can see as you head up towards Stonehaven and maybe up into the western edge of the Cairngorms, there's some engagement. There's a little bit heading out towards Edinburgh, but not hugely, but certainly not that much heading towards Glasgow. So again, so just being aware that seems to be where the pockets outside the area where people are coming from, but really it's all pretty local, and it's low relative to these big high concentrations actually within central Scotland. And again, this is just by sheer numbers. You see actually there are slightly more now near on that the western edge of Edinburgh because the population's higher, but still, you can see that kind of clear concentration that we've already talked about. Okay, so does anyone have any queries about that, or shall I pass it over to Isaac to talk about what else we can say about the audience? So pulling in data from other sources to kind of update this. Okay, in which case, over to you, Isaac. I will click along as you ask me to.
Lovely. So now for something sort of completely different, we've got some sort of very different sources of information. This first one is the Cultural Participation Monitor. That's something that we run several waves of, surveying a few thousand people around the country just on all sorts of things and attitudes, especially throughout the COVID pandemic, to see how things are changing. This first graph, so it's just looking at a few of the groups that we've been focusing on, and when we asked a few thousand people, we've been tracking obviously the coming back essentially to cultural events, and willingness to attend cultural activities with no reservations about COVID-19 is one of them, and that's risen quite a lot recently, to around 50% of people that have no reservations, which is similar in Scotland. But of course there's variety within groups. So as is probably expected, retirees are much more hesitant to come back to cultural activities, whereas students are by far the least hesitant. And it's important to note this includes people not interested in culture sort of at the end, so the percentages are actually higher than appear, so it's not just 50% people. And as you can see sort of in some of the middle ones, there's really sort of only 5-10% of people that are really not keen sort of on returning because of COVID now, which has decreased a lot sort of throughout the pandemic, especially recently. So as I said, this is from the September wave, so it's really showing a change recently. If I could, next slide, if there's anything else on that. Right, so we also asked generally about cultural participation in person and online, And in this, both students and families have almost 100% participation in some form of cultural activity when we ask just over the past year. Whilst, again, perhaps as expected, retirees are quite significantly lower in their going to arts and heritage, though still pretty high, but just a marked difference to other groups. And when it comes to online, it's a trend we'd kind of expect, where students are by far the highest engagers with online activities and cultural events. But families are still nearly double of what the engagement of retirees is, which again is a pattern we kind of might expect to see. And finally, creative activities, that includes everything from like gardening to crafts to gaming. That follows quite a similar pattern, with students are basically almost 100% in terms of some form of creative activity, whereas it's a bit lower in the other groups and retirees. If we get the next slide.
Just say this is for the UK as a whole.
Yes, it's the UK as a whole, of which sort of if Scotland is quite in line throughout this with everything. So that's why it's not its own sort of bar on the chart. And then, of course, the big hot topic at the moment, the cost of living. We asked people a number of questions about the cost of living, and unsurprisingly, there are quite high levels of agreement, with statements about being worried about the cost of living or about spending less on entertainment. But again, that depends exactly on which group you look at. So thought it was quite interesting that when you ask about sort of going to cultural activities or worrying about staying close to home, which is another measure we looked for saving on things like fuel, so other people are staying close by, on both of these, retirees are significantly lower. So you can see fewer paid for activities, retirees is more like 59%, whereas that's more like 80% for families. And throughout these measures, families, perhaps unsurprisingly, kind of have the opposite attitude to retirees. So it's just interesting in terms of audiences, in terms of how they might be affected by the cost of living over the next few months. Retirees seem less worried. I guess they have kind of more of a set income that will probably rise with inflation, whereas families are probably going to be the most hard hit. So again, that follows a similar pattern. If I could get the next slide. Oh, and then as a final thing, with a completely different source of information, so not the Cultural Participation Monitor, but we just looked at what's happening sort of post restrictions. We analysed sort of around 100 venues and just took the recent summer period, kind of an average before COVID happened, and then this recent summer, because we wanted to see our venues getting back to normal in terms of income and tickets. And we did find that on average, sales are back to normal. Sort of they are around 100% in terms of ticket sales, but this hides a massive amount of variation. So this is looking at venues kind of across the UK as to is their income down, is their income up, and then same with tickets. And for instance, here there's the chart shows that 17% of venues are down by a third of income compared to pre-COVID, whereas 22% are up by the same amounts. So there's real variation, and that's even more drastic in some of the venues we looked at, where some are like 50% up. That might be something like an outdoor place, whereas some of them are 9% are actually decreasing income by half. And of course, it's important to note, say if income is at 100% or 110%, this doesn't mean that there isn't a real term decrease, because as we all know, of course, there's massive increases in energy costs and things. So maintaining income level doesn't necessarily mean that a venue is doing as well as it was before the crisis, because that will be a real term drop in income. But it is still quite, we found quite interesting that ticket sales are as well are on average recovering, at least in the most recent period. So if there's any particular questions about that we haven't gone on, then let me know. Otherwise, should I just say a bit about this as well, Ollie, or do you want to hand over?
Yeah, if you could.
Cool. So this is just kind of almost a summary more in terms of the segments. So reattending commuter and coach buffs, they're the most likely to think it's time to get back to normal in one of our questions that we asked about. They are a good sort of 5 or 10% higher than the average. And trips and treats and dormitory dependables, these, as the name says, quite dependable groups, are most likely to be happy to attend. They're back to, again, similar to kind of families and students and groups are similar sort of percentages. And home and heritage had high proportions among survey respondents. So that's kind of heritage rather than performance arts, but they're the most now the most reluctant to attend. So the home and heritage tends to be the older group. So that kind of matches is kind of similar to retirees, which kind of expected. Whereas younger people are very likely to have attended arts and heritage recently, as we saw, it's nearly 100%. As are families, and also the previously highly engaged are returning again, and also those without disabilities. So we do see that there's a difference between the disability group and the not disability group engaging. And as just to say, Scotland overall is pretty much in line with national averages. I think it's like maybe 2 or 3 percentage points higher in terms of willingness to return, but all the other measures are very similar.